Hello, everyone. I'm Susanna Liu Hedberg, Executive Director of the 1990 Institute, a nonprofit that for over 3 decades has championed education and cross-cultural learning to foster better U.S. China relations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our last Teachers Workshop of 2023, a flagship program that we've organized for the past 10 years to support teachers and their students to understand China, U.S. China relations, and Asian American history and culture. We are in a very exciting time in the US where we have a monumental opportunity to make everyone feel represented and visible, starting in the classroom. Understanding differences, but also the many similarities within each of our vibrant communities fosters a better sense of belonging, and teachers are the beacons with the power to make their students feel seen. We at 1990 are so honored to help empower and support teachers by making available various educational resources like this Teachers Workshop series that can help make the biggest impact on the next generation and to create a better society for all of us. Today, we're joined by 23 states and 9 countries who are on this journey with us. And thanks to our sponsors who have supported us in so many ways over this past year. Your partnership and collaboration mean so much. So let's get to it. We'll kick off an overview of the journalist framework with Kaiser, followed by a panel discussion with Amy Chin and Bo-Chen Han to dive deep into their firsthand experiences as journalists, then a Q&A discussion with all 3 of our speakers. This workshop was inspired by the one we organized in June that touched on what was needed for the future of U.S.-China relations. At that workshop, Mary Kay Magstad, David Firestein, and Robert Daly stressed the importance of critical thinking, being more open to different viewpoints, media literacy, and advocating for better access to information and people-to-people exchanges. With election year looming, we are already seeing a trend of anti-China or China competition rhetoric by our presidential hopefuls. And while recent surveys from Lake Research Partners show that voters can see through this scapegoating, we and our partners still see a need to continue the June discussions by bringing experts to share insights on how to evaluate these headlines and reports. So Kaiser Kuo kicks us off for this important discussion. Kaiser, as everyone knows, is a rock star, figuratively and literally. He is the co-founder and lead guitarist of the seminal Chinese heavy metal band Tang Dynasty. He is the host and co-founder of the Sinica podcast, the leading English language podcast on current affairs in China. It has been running continuously since April 2010 and has published over 500 episodes featuring prominent people with expertise on China. Kaiser previously served as Director of International Communications for Baidu, China's leading search engine. Prior to that, he served as Ogilvy's Director of Digital Strategy in China after several years as a tech reporter in Beijing for Red Herring magazine. Kaiser graduated from Berkeley and has a master's in East Asian Studies from the University of Arizona. Kaiser, over to you in setting the scene and providing an overview of the journalist framework.
Thanks so much, Susanna, and thank you to Sandra and to Grace and to all the good people at the 1990 Institute for convening this and for asking me along. I was asked by the organizers to talk a little bit about what we mean by media in the first place. I think for purposes of this discussion, we're going to be speaking about news media, the work done by organizations that consciously think of themselves as in the business of news gathering, of analysis, of reporting, and then of course of dissemination of news through print articles, whether online or in newspapers or in magazines, on television or radio, and yes, even podcasts. This is to distinguish what I'm talking about from other forms of media, which could include simply some guy sounding off on Twitter or on Facebook or TikTok or what have you. And now some of these may indeed rise to what I'm talking about here as news media, but I don't think we need to get too bogged down in definitions. That said, within news media here in the US, I think for the last 100 years, since the early decades to the 20th century, we have generally had this distinction between, on the one hand, news reporting, which makes a good faith effort to be factual, to make empirical and falsifiable truth claims rather than normative claims. That is, it treats in is rather than should be. And on the other hand, opinion and editorial, op-ed, which of course is all about should and is rather unapologetically normative. Now there has been some erosion of this, and I think that is regrettable. But I think a mark of a good, reputable news organization is that it makes this distinction clearly. It doesn't blur the lines either deliberately or simply out of negligence, and it keeps this very clear wall between op-ed on the one hand and news reporting on the other. There are, of course, many so-called news organizations that just pretend to be empirical, dispassionate, neutral, or whatever you want to say, objective, but simply aren't, and honestly don't try to be. They are very much agenda-driven. They usually, wear their values plainly enough, but sometimes they attempt to disguise them. But it doesn't take much media savvy to detect those. I mean, really, there's no hard and fast rule of thumb for me to explain, or to really kind of describe in the time allotted how to to ferret out those sort of less on the up and up actors. But it is alarming to me how many people seem unable to do so. So media literacy is super important. It's just not something that I can really address in any kind of meaningful way just in the time allotted. This is not to suggest that news organizations that are widely regarded by the media literate, by the savvy individuals out there, as reputable, that these are entirely free of bias. By no means are they. What we are talking about here today is really foreign correspondence. We're talking about how specifically China is reported from here in the U.S. So let me cut straight to it. I most emphatically do not believe that, and I mean, in what I'm going to, for convenience sake, call the mainstream media is out to smear China, to make it look deliberately, bad. I don't believe there is some grand conspiracy among editorial boards and, say, the military-industrial complex, to gin up, American righteous anger toward a war with China. In fact, I've had the great pleasure in almost all my incarnations of knowing many, many journalists, probably numbering in the hundreds, uh, who are very hardworking, very honest. They are not people who are in this profession for the money. I can absolutely assure you of that. But they are among the finest people of tremendous personal integrity that I've met. And so, no, I do not believe that there is some conspiracy. But that said, there are some very profound structural problems that effectively create biases. What we need as news consumers to be able to do is understand the sources of those and adjust for them. We need to understand the optical properties of the lens through which so many of us know what we believe we know about a country as important as China. And the same goes for reporting on, say, Russia or India or Iran or Indonesia or anywhere else with which we are not familiar. I had the great pleasure and honor of counting among my friends Peter Hessler. If you don't know Peter, he writes for the New Yorker. He's the author of a fantastic trilogy of books about China, about his time there as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1990s, all the way up until he left China, around the eve of the Olympics in 2008. So these three books are sort of a gold standard. The writing that he's done since, for people who want to see genuinely empathetic writing. And I had a conversation with him. I've had many conversations about this issue of media bias. He tells a fantastic story, I think, that is really, really illuminating. He talks about how when he arrived as an English teacher in the city of Fuling, in what's now Chongqing, that was then still part of Sichuan, one of the materials that he was given to teach out of was this book called Survey of Britain and America. And it contained in it, really great lines like, the Constitution of 1787 established a dictatorship, the American bourgeoisie. And it also had a long section on social problems in America that included a litany of crimes that had been committed on college campuses. And he looked at this and he thought, my gosh, I mean, I bet if I went and I examined them, most of these claims are actually true, but taken as they are so out of context and just lumped together in this long list of rapes and murders and strangulations and shootings, all this stuff, and mass killings. it would give you a very skewed idea of what America is, and I think it was very much intended to do so. And then he thought, well, gosh, if I put the shoe on the other foot, what am I reading about China? Often I find a lot of stuff that's sort of decontextualized, drawn out, and factually true, perhaps, but taken out. So I have arrived at that same conclusion quite independently, and it has occurred to me that if I pick up an issue of the New York Times, my happens to be my favorite newspaper, and I'm sitting here as an American, somebody who's lived, a great deal of my life in the United States, and I read it, I am going to read a lot of stories about perfidy. I'm going to read a lot of, stories about uh, corrupt Supreme Court justices, say, for example, or extremist groups, or gun violence. Obviously, I mean, lots and lots of gun violence, or um, you know, another story about an innocent unarmed black motorist gunned down by cops. Um, and I'll read a lot of stories that would, taken only out of context, would lead me to think that the world's on fire, that America's on fire. That if I were to open a window, I would hear the sound of people rushing to the barricades and smell tires burning in the streets. But I know this not to be the case because I live here. I have the lived experience of being an American. I mean, as bad as things are, I know that I have that sort of leavening. I know there are a lot of quotidian things that happen all the time, but that newspaper will be full of those stories as well as the ones about the malfeasance and the violence and whatnot. Um, so between my lived experience and the ballast in the rest of the kind of more ordinary reporting, I don't get this extreme view of America, right? From reading the New York Times. However, if I read that same newspaper and I only read 6 or 7 stories about China, and every one of them is selected because it is newsworthy, because people do not write about the bridges that didn't collapse, they don't write about the planes that landed safely. I mean, news, it has to be newsworthy, and so it's going to be out of the ordinary almost by definition. Um, and they don't have the column inches to shove in lots and lots of context. It's simply not possible to do. So this is not the fault of the news reporters. This is a structural issue. Now, I happen to think that the American form of adversarial journalism has served this country extremely well. I mean, I think of 4 recent years, for example, and it's gone on way longer than that, where I was very, very grateful that certain papers were saying democracy dies in darkness, and were really, really keen on holding power to account. I think it's a very, very good thing, but we have to ask ourselves whether that model travels perfectly when we apply it to foreign correspondence. I'll talk about another New Yorker correspondent here who happens also to be a friend of mine, but Jiayang Fan, who writes for the New Yorker. She spent her childhood in China, and at a New Yorker conference once, she was asked by David Remnick on stage to talk about what it feels like as somebody who grew up in China to read foreign correspondents writing in English about that familiar country. And she said something I think was really brilliant, and I've repeated it many times, but it's that she said it's like looking at a familiar part of my body, my hand, for example, through an X-ray, in that it is literally penetrating, it's anatomically precise, it's accurate, but it is not realistic as far as it doesn't feel like my hand because it lacks that the blood vessels and the flesh, the nails, all the other parts of it that make it that familiar piece of my body. Um, I feel that exact same experience when I often read news where it was unarguably, just absolutely inarguably accurate, but it doesn't in sum total represent what I would call an accurate I mean, a realistic portrayal. It doesn't add up to realism. So that I think is at the heart of it. So I would enjoin people to look for certain qualities in the way that people write about China. One of them that I really, really want to emphasize is a sense of cognitive empathy. I think that what's often lost and what separates really, really good journalists from the not so good is When one of your first moves is to try to present uh, Chinese perspectives on an issue, and then to do it in good faith and to do it in with a real knowledge of the cognitive apparatus that's informing those perspectives, that is a mark of a good journalist. Journalists who demonstrate a bit of humility, who understand that there are limits to what they can actually know. I mean, a lot of them, I think they bang their heads up against the opacity of the Chinese political system often. Uh, I also think that the good ones, look, reporting in China is, and as I'm sure that you'll hear, it can be extremely frustrating. I was fortunate enough, I was on a beat and in a time when it wasn't so horrible, but I have plenty of friends who have had firsthand experience uh, with harassment and surveillance, with people who have, tossed their rooms deliberately while their hotel rooms while they're on reporting trips, who have even, intimidated, detained, even, roughed up reporters. So it's not an easy thing, and it's pretty easy to imagine how shabby treatment of foreigners might maybe beget more negative writing, which in turn might beget more shabby treatment and on down in a kind of negative spiral. I think that most of the reporters I know don't fall into that trap, though. I think they are, despite having been ill-used often and challenged in their reporting, they still maintain that same integrity, that commitment to journalistic truths that I find just so admirable. I'll stop there. I mean, there's so much more to say, but I really am curious to hear what the actual practitioners are. What I do is a species, I suppose, of journalism, but these are kind of often very long, kind of heady interviews um, with people who are often academics or diplomats or former diplomats and people like that. It's not the same as breaking news, which people like Bochen and Amy have done. Amy has done amazing frontline reporting, and I'm sure she'll talk about it in Wuhan during the height of the COVID pandemic. So I mean, I ask that we all recognize the personal courage that's often involved on the part of correspondents, and put aside your suspicions of conspiracy to smear China. That is not uh, in 99% of cases what's happening. There are structural problems with the way that news is reported. We need to keep those in mind. We need to understand the optical properties of the lens, how it diffracts, how it distorts, how it magnifies some things and makes other appear further away. But once you get your head around those things, I think you can really, I think, become a much more informed consumer of the news. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaiser, for that and setting the scene for what's to come with our panel discussion with Bochen and with Amy. So next, I would like to introduce you to our next two speakers. Amy Chin is a national correspondent for the New York Times covering Asian American communities. She joined the Times in 2012 and previously worked as a correspondent based in Beijing and Taipei. She is part of a team that published a series that was a Pulitzer finalist in international reporting. And in early 2020, during the start of the COVID pandemic, she was one of the few foreign correspondents on the ground in Wuhan, as Kaiser mentioned, after the city was locked down. Amy is a graduate of Berkeley and Oxford and has taught international reporting at Berkeley. Bochen Han is a DC-based correspondent covering U.S. China relations for the South China Morning Post since 2022. Previously, she worked on issues at the intersection of international relations, human rights, and development across the U.S., Myanmar, Thailand, with organizations such as the UN Human Rights Regional Office in Bangkok, a participatory research and advocacy organization, and a tech social enterprise that focused on hate speech and municipal governance. She holds degrees in political science and China studies from Duke University and Johns Hopkins SAIS. So I want to start off this panel discussion with some of this on the ground perspectives and firsthand experiences with the both of you. And Amy, so I'll start with you first. Not only do you abide by some of what Kaiser has mentioned in his segment, newsworthiness, cognitive empathy, but also as a visiting professor, you teach students to uphold this kind of journalistic integrity as well. What are some of the examples of ethical considerations and reliable sources of information that guide your reporting, and how do you instill that or teach that to your students?
Thanks so much, Susanna, and thank you so much to the 1990 Institute for arranging this really important panel today. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are so many ethical considerations that go into reporting on China, which is one of the most fascinating places right now and so dynamic to report on. One thing that comes to mind is, you know, I started reporting in China in 2012 and was there basically over the next decade, with a little bit of time outside of China, but mostly in Beijing and around there. And one thing that I had discovered as I was reporting there, it was a really valuable experience to cut my teeth as a young journalist in China, because I found that many things are very difficult to report on there. I mean, Kaiser mentioned the surveillance, the harassment, and a lot of it goes also to just trying to convince people to talk to you. I mean, here in the U.S., for most stories now, I'm realizing I'm working in D.C. covering the country. Here, I can just sort of walk up to people and they ask them a question about how do you feel about this or that, and most people will engage with me, and it's been really easy, especially compared to times in China. And I think that looking back at my time in China, um, I realized that basically you have to make the effort. It's not always going to be super easy. You might approach someone and they might say no, but that doesn't mean that the story isn't worth getting. And at the same time, I think you have to also make the effort to try to triangulate your information. You might hear a piece of information in one place, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. You have to make the effort to fact check. I mean, this is for, any beat that you're doing, but especially so in China, where so much of the stuff isn't just immediately given to you, but you actually have to find ways of sort of getting at it. I'm thinking, for example, in Xinjiang, and that's how some of the most amazing work that was done on Xinjiang by reporters like Mega Rajagopalan and the Wall Street Journal, and even my own colleagues at the New York Times. A lot of that was done through just sort of putting together many different data points and kind of from there sort of understanding what was going on in Xinjiang. So I think that, yeah, those would probably be my kind of takeaways, is sort of make the effort. And of course, always consider the safety of the people that you're speaking with and the people that you're working with. China is a difficult place to work for anyone, but especially so if you're someone who is a Chinese citizen, and the state has leverage over you in a way that is sort of difficult for many of us here in the U.S. to imagine. You might be threatened, your family might be threatened if you speak to a journalist. You might be threatened yourself. And a lot of Chinese journalists really take a huge risk by going out there and, doing really important reporting to try to bring truth to the of what's happening, what they're seeing. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And so you bring this up, holding telling truths. And so, I know that you've covered high level stories, about the government, but then also everyday stories, about how Chinese citizens thrived and coped and struggled. And these kinds of stories are so important in showing the humanistic sides that can eventually help build bridges and understanding between different cultures. So I kind of want to touch on that a little bit. How do you balance the stories that, one, not only hold power to account, but then also write these everyday features?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that those are the stories that I most enjoy doing. Just a few that come to mind that I was able to do in my time in China. I did a story about a female sex orgasm workshop in Beijing. That was amazing to go see. I did a story about rappers in Chengdu and the rap scene, about snowbirds in Sanya, and the list goes on. And it was really, for me as a reporter, getting to travel to all these places, speak to all these people, that was so much fun, but also it was so rewarding because I felt like I was highlighting the sort of dynamic place that I know China to be, and that anyone who's had the privilege of going to China, as soon as you step off the plane, you can see that it is a place that's not just, you know, authoritarianism and sort of doom and gloom. It is a place that has a lot of people who are living in the system and who have different interests and hobbies, and as you might expect. So I found that I tried my best to do both. I mean, it was a constant sort of tussle between doing the stories that hold power to account, because those are so important to do as well, and we can't forget about those. I did find that over time, as I was in China, it became more difficult to do some of the more sort of cultural or society stories that I think do highlight some of the sort of dynamic parts of the country. You know, during COVID, I remember we wanted to do a story about how box office in movies, because China was doing so well in controlling COVID, you know, if, when people in the US and other places were sort of struggling with lots of cases, and China had these very, you know, heavy-handed measures that allowed them to sort of return to some sense of normalcy in society. So we wanted to do a story about how the box office movie theaters are doing very well during this time. And at that point, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, but at that point, you know, many American journalists, including myself, had been kicked out of China because of U.S. China tensions. And so something that might have before just required me to go across the street and talk to people at a movie theater, like, why are you going to the movies today? Then required me sitting in Taiwan, working with four basically other people on my team to try to figure out, okay, who can go out with someone else to this theater, and these are the questions that I wanted to ask. And all I wanted was something as really just innocent as just, why are you going to the movies today? And that became just a really difficult task. And I think that one slowed down the reporting process a lot, and made it more difficult to do these types of sort of, you know, everyday stories that I think readers want to read, that I think really do highlight how uh, diverse and dynamic the country is.
Yes, and you know, you do touch on this, and that is actually that was my next kind of question for you, right? You mentioned that there was lack of access, that you know, lack of, you know, boots on the ground, so to speak, and then sometimes even this surveillance that you speak on. What, you know, what were some of the other obstacles that, you know, our readers, you know, everyday readers may not know when you are trying to share this, you know, big picture of what China is and its citizenry, right? Just taking Kaiser's comment about, you know, getting the whole part rather than just, you know, or some of all parts rather than just individual kind of snapshots. And you know, in thinking about these obstacles, how do you think that these obstacles potentially skew the stories that are told and eventually skew public perceptions?
I think that China is difficult of a place because you can talk to a few people, but it's really difficult to generalize about the country. Here, I've realized through reporting on the U.S. that we rely a lot on polling. You know, we look at Pew and the surveys that they do, and that really helps us sort of, you know, zoom out a little bit. Like, this story is representative of this trend that's happening in China, but it's really difficult to do, or in the United States, but it's very difficult to do that in China because we don't have good, accurate polling about how people are feeling or what they think about certain things. And so that makes our job as journalists very difficult, because you're trying to write about a whole country and use, you know, one sort of case or a few cases as representative of that phenomenon. And I think that does end up sort of skewing the coverage a little bit, but you know, you still have to do your best, make the effort to sort of figure out what's going on there.
So, and then, you know, really touching on what you had shared, you know, about the stories, about going to the movies, but also like right before, you know, foreign correspondents were asked to leave. You know, within the you know, just to give everyone kind of a sense of coverage and the differences in how potential stories are covered, especially within the context of COVID coverage, are there comparisons that can be drawn between how, for example, the U.S. covered the story versus how China covered the story? And what can we take away from that?
Sure. Should I go into? I have a few. Okay, great. I have a presentation about this. Very short. As Kaiser mentioned, I was able to go to Wuhan right at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which ended up being my last trip. I didn't know that at the time, reporting trip in China. And it was a very, very rewarding trip. I got there right after the city was locked down. And it was really interesting to see the different narratives that were being put out by the Chinese media, and also that, as we were also trying to report on it ourselves. So this is a sort of simplistic example. I don't think it's the best example, but it's sort of, I think it kind of shows the value of having people on the ground. I saw on February 2nd, 2020, Xinhua is the Chinese state news agency. It's sort of like the official, one of the official mouthpieces for the Chinese government. And they had said that in response to these rising cases in Wuhan, that they had built a new hospital in 10 days to combat the coronavirus. And, we're used to seeing these types of stories that kind of show how China is, the government is sort of acting quickly to sort of respond to things, and it really was. But I thought, when I was in Wuhan, I was like, let's go visit this hospital. So we found a car to take us out to this hospital. That was very difficult, actually, because so many people were so scared at that time still that no one was really venturing out. But we managed to convince one person to take us to the hospital. We found that it was really far from finished. There was a lot going on there. This is the photo taken a day after the previous slide, the photo shown on the previous slide. And I found, this big construction pit. I'm not saying that, it wasn't, it didn't look the same. And I thought it really showed me in that instant, like, oh, this is sort of different than what I would been expecting to see and what China is sort of projecting out into the world. And so what we ended up writing is a story about how China was close to building this, hospital. We didn't really focus on the fact that, oh, it's not the same. And it is an incredible feat, no matter how you spend it 10 or 11 days, 12 days, whatever it is. And so that just is sort of a small sample of why I think it's so important to have people who are on the ground who can kind of see what's going on behind just what the government wants you to see. In terms of other narratives too, I just mentioned Xinhua. It's sort of the official Chinese state news agency. There are plenty of other, and though a dwindling number of Chinese media outlets that are not necessarily just Chinese state run. They might be run within the Chinese media system and subject to censorship as well. But there are really amazing journalists who work within these outlets who are putting out incredible work. And so Caixin is an example of this. They, had the courage to run these articles by this writer named Fang Fang, who was quite critical of the Chinese government's response to COVID in the beginning in Wuhan. And I think both Caixin and Fang Fang got a lot of criticism for that from Chinese people and from the government because of that. Sixth Tone, which I think actually, it also did a lot of work on this front as well. I know that they put out this memory project, which sort of collecting oral histories of what happened during the Shanghai lockdown in China, which was a very traumatic experience for many people living in Shanghai. So, I think it's important to remember that just because something is, Chinese state affiliated media doesn't mean that it's not necessary, that it's something that you have to discount altogether. On the contrary, they do some of the best reporting on China under very, very, very difficult circumstances. They might be subject to censorship, but it's still, they're doing their best to sort of do this sort of cat and mouse game to get the reporting out. And I would say that the third sort of takeaway in terms of media narratives is, we have to remember that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And this is something that I really, that I sort of witnessed myself with the story that I wrote in March about how it was sort of talking about the lockdowns in China that had been going on, and at that point, they were quite heavy-handed. People were stuck in Wuhan. They weren't able. No one was able to really leave, and at the same time, because of this, they were able to curb the number of cases really quickly. When the story was published, it happened to be right at the time where it seemed like China was getting COVID under control after really struggling with it right in the beginning, and COVID was starting to pick up in other countries like the United States. And I remember when this story was published, I got a lot of criticism from people that I knew in China because they said, look at your own country. This lockdowns have served us so well. And it was so interesting to sort of think about that, and then also to see how thoughts about this sort of changed over the course of the next few years as lockdowns became something that we started seeing in many different places. And, they all kind of played out in different ways. I think even now we're still probably going to be litigating how effective these lockdowns were. Certainly later on in China, I think some people changed their minds about how effective lockdowns were. People who were in Shanghai or in other places whose jobs and careers and lives were, very adversely affected by that. And so, going back to this idea that journalism is really a first draft of history, and from the big also, look at datelines. There's nothing that can replace old-fashioned on-the-ground reporting. So when you see at the start of an article, it says Wuhan, China, that means that person was actually in Wuhan and reported on that. Look for people who are actually giving you on-the-ground reporting and not just regurgitating things that have been written by other people, secondhand, third-hand information. And then also, of course, pay attention to your sources. Know the difference between different sources of information. Think about, is this coming from Chinese state media? Is it coming from other Chinese media outlets that are not necessarily state-controlled media? Is it American media? And of course, within American media, that's a big ecosystem that we can break down at another time. But I think that these are just sort of some of the takeaways that I think about when I'm contemplating my own experience in reporting in China. And that's it.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. That was, I learned so much from that kind of like overview of what you just shared. I want to come back to that actually in the larger panel discussion or Q&A session. So for the time being, I just want to thank you really quickly. And I'm going to shift this conversation then over to Bo-Chen now. And before I do that, I just want to let our audience know that if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A function or the chat function. And my colleague Stephanie and I'm seeing Kaiser answering some of these live as well. So feel free to use those functions and we will address them in the Q&A session soon. So Bo-Chen, I want to tie in with Amy's kind of last takeaway because that's the one thing that I remember because of her repetition in it. That journalism is the first draft of history. And when you and I chatted not too long ago, you shared with me why you chose to pursue journalism. Can you share with us, what viewpoints you thought were potentially missing in the drafts of history that you were reading? And has that changed since you became a reporter?
Hello, everyone. Great to be here with all of you. So basically, I came into journalism because I was frustrated with the narratives that I was seeing presented in the media, and I wanted more nuance reflected in stories about U.S. China relations, particularly stories coming from here in the U.S. as opposed to from reporters in China. I saw a lot of stories about Chinese influence that was very vague and not very well substantiated. Stories always assuming nefarious intent, strategic intent from the Chinese government, perhaps often giving them too much credit for what they're doing outside of their own borders. So that all of those experiences, observing English language reporting about Chinese influence here in the US and outside really brought me to want to, come to a place. And I thought journalism is a place where, you can ask questions without predetermined answers. And that's what really brought me to this field. I think as time went on, I observed a lot of the structural issues that Kaiser was referencing in his introduction. In terms of, the media really prioritizes more negative, dramatic stories. This you can see from not just the headline, but even just how a piece is structured. You have more interesting things at the top so that you can keep the readers, going through the story as it progresses. You have some misaligned incentives, I think, between the reporter and the people writing the headlines, which are often the editors. And I think these are very, very fair incentives, because in the sense that reporters want to capture perhaps the essence of the story in the headline, whereas the editor wants the story to be read, because what's the point of writing a really good piece if no one reads the piece. And often editors are also coming into the story cold. The reporter is spending a lot of time putting together the story. So I think everyone is working with different incentives to make a really good product at the end. But sometimes that leads to, very dramatic headlines that may not reflect the entire essence of the story. And I think over time, I entered journalism only a year ago. I realized that, as Amy was saying, we're writing the first draft of history. Often this is referencing, how time is of the essence. So a lot of times we go into stories having a bit of pre-writing, and we have to get very pithy takes out as soon as we can because of the news cycle. And I think with that comes sometimes with the ease of repeating war narratives. So things that have been said a lot, just because of time constraints. So that's another. I think that's a structural issue, and of course, there's ways to how to get around that by being very conscious of trying to inject as much context as you can in larger stories. Or I think if you have more familiarity with a topic, it'll be easier to, inject context in a very short amount of time. I think something else I realized as time went on was you only get oftentimes what others will let you know. People only want to talk to you when they have a message they want to advance. So it's usually a mutually beneficial relationship where the journalist wants to get really interesting nuggets for their story, and then the source wants to advance some sort of goal, agenda, and that's why they want to talk to you. And I think it's on the role of the journalist to make sure you understand where the source is coming from and then add that context into the stories. But sometimes I feel that due to time constraints and other constraints, that's not adequately reflected. I think something I really found valuable over time was learning about, just how anonymous sources work, when it comes to stories, especially ones in to do with like elite politics, both in the U.S. and China. Why we have to ask the question, like, why would a source come anonymously with certain information to your particular outlet? So I think that's something really important for educators to think about, because it's something that I've had to grapple with. And just, I think overall, there's a lot of reasons why some things are covered and some things aren't, and it's not always a reflection of the importance of the story. It's often a reflection of, what resources we have on that day. Is this timely? Is this something that our particular audience would be interested in? So there's a lot of reasons that go into why something is covered, not covered. So I think after, over a year now in the media industry, it makes a lot of sense to me now why certain narratives that that really were present that a year ago that really frustrated me and that really brought me into the industry. So I think it's good for everyone to just understand all the things that go into the incentives for the media industry, because it'll allow you to better assess the sources that you read.
I would love to unpack. I mean, there was just so much that you shared there that I would love to unpack. But let's start first with kind of what you mentioned here about headlines and context, and also just nuance. So I suppose I wanted to ask you, is there an example of a headline or story in recent U.S. China related news that plays into this? What you've shared in terms of incentivization, but also context in terms of how China stories get covered?
So this is a really interesting example I had recently where I was tuning into a hearing that was hosted by the one of the congressional committees. It's called the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. And we didn't actually end up covering the story, but it was a very interesting experience for me because the headlines that actually came out of that hearing were not reflective at all of my experience listening to the hearing. And so at the actual hearing, a lot of the farmers, and these are farmers in Iowa, were mostly saying that they were, very concerned about losing market access to China for their soybeans, that China was a very important export market, and that, if there was intellectual property theft from China, they would be concerned, but they hadn't themselves seen signs of this in Iowa based on their personal experience. But then the headlines that came out of this hearing, as you can see, is Iowa farmers accuse China of stealing seeds. Iowa farmers stop China for undermining U.S. agriculture, which I thought were very interesting because these were messages that were coming more from the members of the committee who were present at the hearing. So by members of the committee, these are lawmakers, congressional representatives. And I think the larger lessons from this experience is just that there's always opinions that aren't going to be reflected in the headlines, and no headline or even article can really capture the full range of opinions. I think lower down in these articles written by, these are all U.S. outlets, by the way. One of them is Newsweek, and then two of them are more local Iowa media. And so I think people mostly, and I think the other message is that people mostly speak to the media because they want to promote a particular narrative, which is usually tied to a specific political or business goal. And it's important to go to different sources and read the actual quotes and see what the farmers actually said, as opposed to just focusing on the headline. And I have another slide, and the first headline here actually is very interesting, in that I think it actually more accurately captures what was said at the hearing, because the comments were made by the House committee members as opposed to the Iowa farmers. And this slide is also just I don't know how many of you are aware of a lot of the rhetoric around China buying up U.S. farmland, and I included two examples here of headlines that were just showing how, quite alarmist headlines saying China is buying U.S. farmland at a very alarming rate. Hostile foreign countries are purchasing U.S. farmland. And I think headlines like these kind of ignore questions about, why is this a threat to our national security? How much land is China actually buying, and what purpose does it serve? Of course, they definitely, you can't necessarily say that these are inaccurate, but I think if these perpetuate without counter narratives and like other sorts of questions being asked, then it kind of portrays an image that this is part of China's grand strategic plan, and there's a lot of this is happening at alarming rates, and it's really a threat to American American people, American lives. The last headline that you would see on this page is something I think a paper like the South China Morning Post, we would run a headline like this. This is from CNN saying, states accelerate efforts to block Chinese purchase of agricultural land. I think at some point, I mean, this is a true thing that is happening. Even if you think the attention on this issue is overblown, you can't, not report on it because it's still something that's happening. And I think the greater lesson is like that context is everything. And this brings me to this third slide about counter narratives. So the first headline you'll see is actually from the South China Morning Post. Buying American farmland is not part of China's grand agricultural investment strategy. U.S. panel told, and we can only do this kind of reporting once a claim has been made. So, we wouldn't run this headline if there wasn't already a bunch of claims made about, China buying agricultural land. But yeah, I think over time, you'll see more articles talking about or questioning the dominant narrative. There's an NBC News investigation here saying, is China really buying up U.S. farmland? A really good magazine called The Wire China, which was started, I think, a couple of years ago by a former New York Times reporter, David Barboza. They also ran a piece questioning whether the Chinese buying of land was a threat to national security. So you see these kind of more counter narrative reporting pop up a bit later on. It's usually not present in the initial stages because you have to wait until the initial claims have already been made. But later on, you get more of this nuance, and a lot of these articles point out, foreign ownership of land only accounts for 3% of privately held agricultural land in the U.S., and Chinese entities own less than 1% of that amount. So why are we so concerned about, less than 1% of 3%? Of course, I think these are the type of questions that pop up later on and that are important to ask. I think, for educators, it goes back to what Susanna was saying at the very beginning. You need to have a more critical lens and ask the bigger fundamental questions as opposed to just relying on the headline. And interesting enough, I tried looking at how Chinese media was covering this, and there was very little coverage of this in Chinese state media or otherwise. Although I did find one example of an article in the Global Times, which is a tabloid media in China, which says, the U.S. should ensure fairness in Chinese firms' land deal, which isn't exactly, dramatic, but it's kind of the sentiment that you see in a lot of Chinese media when it comes to stories about Chinese influence, saying, the U.S. isn't being fair, U.S. is drumming up hysteria. But I think overall, the fact that it's not being covered very much is also fairly telling. But yeah, I think just the broader takeaway is that you really have to, go beyond the headline, read the actual articles, see the evidence that is being presented, look at different sources, because different reporters, different outlets coming into a specific hearing or event might come up with different conclusions, and it really depends on like a lot of media reporting really depends on a bunch of different incentives, especially when it comes to political actors that build collaborative relationships with different media outlets. And so, yeah, and also, there is really good reporting later on that is more counter narrative, that is more nuanced, that takes a deeper look, but that usually appears quite a bit after the initial stage of reporting. But it's always worth it to follow up and see what kind of work is being done later on when, reporters have a bit more time to really delve into the issues and ask the questions.
Bo-Chen, you bring out so many interesting differences in just this farmland purchasing story alone, which I've definitely seen and read over the past several weeks. And so what you bring up, for example, is just the understanding of the context of the kind of publication, the type of audience that you have. And then, you point out, for example, that SCMP wouldn't necessarily make that kind of headline. So, I kind of want to ask you then, as an offshore publication with more global audience, what are some of those considerations you make for these global audiences?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely struggle a bit because we, as a Hong Kong paper, we don't have a very strong home market. We write for a very global audience, as you said. We're in a position where we have a lot of readers who are very suspicious of the Chinese government, and who are also readers who are very suspicious of the U.S. government. And trying to remain a credible source to everyone is difficult, because what looks to be objective to one reader may look very biased to another. And something that I think we're especially careful in terms of distinguishing is we're careful to distinguish between a government's claims, positions, opinions from the facts as we understand them. Generally, when it comes to a more controversial topic, we would try very hard in terms of not endorsing either side, along with finding comments from independent experts and trying to add as much context as we have in the short amount of time that we have. And in terms of just other more basic considerations, I think because we're writing for a global audience, we do try a bit harder to explain some basic context and details about things related to the U.S. government or the Chinese government that other papers might assume their readers already know. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Bo-Chen. And so I'm noting the time right now, and I'm getting some alerts from my team that we should head over to our Q&A session. So at this time, I want to thank both Bo-Chen and Amy again, and let's head over to our Q&A session now and invite all of our speakers back on. And I'd like to also introduce my co-moderator for this session, Willie Ho. He is a dedicated journalism and English teacher with the New York City Department of Education, and he's been a teacher for almost a decade. He teaches at one of the top-ranked schools in the nation. He received his master's in secondary English education from NYU and a master's of education from Columbia Teachers College. So welcome everyone back. I don't see Willie though. Ah, there he is. Wonderful. All right. So I will get us started and kind of ask this question to Bo-Chen first, but then please Amy and Kaiser chime in, because Bo-Chen did respond and talk about some anonymous sources, right? And in the back of our minds, and also for some of the questions that we've received from folks who registered, one of the big questions is, how do you go about evaluating information and identifying reliable sources for your stories? And especially within the context of, China headlines or China reports, where people are maybe, utilizing open source information and things like that. How do you go about evaluating that?
I can start, but definitely would appreciate other people jumping in. I think, as I said earlier, it's always very important for journalists to realize that, when people are talking to you, if you're doing a lot of, human source reporting, that they usually have a goal they want to advance. And that's totally legitimate for them to have, agenda behind what they're doing. But it's really important for the journalists to recognize that and then reflect that in the reporting by adding relevant context or fact checking them. I always say I like to talk to academics because maybe they're the only experts who don't have an immediate interest in what they're telling you. I think often they want to just, tell you what they think is right, as opposed to, advance a very immediate goal. I often try to seek out information from multiple sources just to confirm, and also just to see what the range of perspectives are. If a bunch of people agree on something, perhaps it's more likely to be true. Okay.
Absolutely. I really second what Bo-Chen said about academics going to them first. It is sort of my own propensity, but I think that it's important just to have a really good Rolodex, just a really good list of people who are your established go-to people who have a track record of not only sort of knowledge but also of being relatively dispassionate while being also deeply informed. It's hard to find, but there are people to whom you can turn. Their body of work often speaks for itself, and you can sort of ferret out who has an agenda and who does not. So I think a journalist is only as good as his or her sources, really. Amy, you want to throw in on this?
Yeah, I would echo what all of you said, and certainly with going to academics. I just think that when a piece is well done, at least you'll have done so much more reporting than what you actually see in the article. And some of it is also just having conversations with people to I take the fact checking process very seriously, and to the point where if you show an academic or whoever you're working with that you're doing something in good faith, that they will sit down with you and really just go through it very carefully. They have an interest. Insofar as they have an interest in wanting to see accurate reporting on a subject that they care a lot about. Mm-hmm. So I just think that obviously, you have time pressures oftentimes with a lot of the writing, but it's really important to, as much as possible, do fact checking.
Oh, I had a question actually. Given the idea that you were talking about staying objective, and I also heard the word rhetorics mentioned, and my students were very eager to know this for themselves. As a journalist, are you typically limited to particular phrasing when reporting? Like, is it designed a certain way to remain as objective as possible, or is there like a set of words that you have to maintain in your rhetoric or anything like that?
So I know that a lot of organizations have style guides, and often this is the exact sort of thing that gets debated in newsroom staff meetings, right? I think that you should be very sensitive to it. There are words that are inherently pejorative that are freighted, have a moral valence to them. We don't speak, for example, of uh, the Trudeau regime. We don't speak of the Schroeder regime. We do speak, though, all the time of the Putin regime, and that's fair. I mean, I don't think, but should we call it the Xi regime or the CCP regime? That's something that it unquestionably has a normative valence to it, but it's something to be debated. What do you call the what's happening in Xinjiang right now? Do you call it repression? Do you call it, cultural genocide? Do you just use the unmodified genocide? I mean, there's an awful lot of minefields out there in how you deploy the rhetoric. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I was also curious, like, um, and I don't know if this is worded well, but I know you just mentioned about having like a certain guideline, but like if you were, given your profession, if you were employed by a certain um news company, would they be more would they limit your reports in any way, if that makes sense?
You mean do you get sort of corporate pressure to report a certain way or to
Yeah,
select certain stories? I'll leave
yeah.
that. I mean, I have not had. I've been blessed because we were very, very independent. But I'd be really curious to hear what Butch and Naomi have to say about that.
I mean, I think that just having worked on a story for a long time, sometimes you get assigned a story and there is an idea of what that story might turn into, but it's always dependent on what you find and what you report. And what you go in there thinking you're going to write isn't always necessarily what you're going to write in the end. And I personally haven't experienced someone telling me that I need to write something one way or another. I mean, of course, there's always back and forth with your editor about how a story should be framed and whatnot. That's just sort of the editor journalist relationship, but not in a way that's sort of pushing any kind of ideological line, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would just go back to something I said earlier, which is oftentimes articles don't happen. There's so many reasons why it doesn't happen. It could just be, it's not a timely enough issue, or it's harder to justify for the particular audience that you have. I think with a lot of U.S. outlets, you would have to, you know, for a story on China, you have to justify, oh, why should the U.S. audience care about this? For the South China Morning Post, I think sometimes it's a bit of a struggle because we don't have a very clear, home audience, because Hong Kong only accounts for, I think, about 30% of our readership, and then we have the rest of the world, and I think 40% of our readers are in North America. So it's often having to justify why this matters to the audience that you're trying to address.
Got it. Thank you. And Bochin, thank you. This was actually my next question. Um, so and hopefully if you could just explain this at the most basic level so all students can understand. Because I don't know the age of the demographics that we're working with right now. But if you were to tell students what they need to know about their headlines, what would that be? Like when reading headlines, what do they have to be aware of? Sorry if it's too tough of a question.
Yeah, I can suggest one thing. I mean, I think that people need to understand that the journalist 99% of the time has nothing to do with the writing of the headline. This is a common misperception that journalists will be blamed for what the headline actually says above their story, and that's actually, in almost all cases, unfair.
Though I will say that I am being encouraged to write more of my own headlines,
I'm glad to
as
hear that.
just because I think it sort of helps you focus the story also as you're writing too, to know what the sort of takeaway should be, and it gives you more sort of say in what the story takeaway, the headline should be as well. I
About
guess in
time, yeah.
yeah. No, but anyway, it just adds more time onto anyway. I think that I would just say I would encourage students, maybe because I feel like I'm edging into boomerism and think of students as sort of all people, including myself, as having just very short attention spans, that I would hope that when people would read to the end, that, of course, read the headline, but get into the story and read to the end, because oftentimes people have great quotes and nuggets that they leave for the kicker, and they can kind of tie the story up that in a way that's very rewarding.
I would echo Amy in that I think that we're increasingly encouraged to speak up when we think a headline is, extremely misrepresentative. But obviously, you have to, pick your battles in the newsroom. You can't, criticize every single headline that you think is inaccurate or misrepresentative, not inaccurate. I would say, though, as I said earlier, editors have the incentive of getting the stories clicked on in the first place, read in the first place. And so I think students should be aware that many times it will be not necessarily a summary of the piece, like, the greatest takeaway. It could just be, one of the more interesting elements from the piece that will grab your attention. And also just that, the diversity of opinions, perspectives can't be summarized in a headline. There's so many cases where I wanted to do a story because of something really interesting, but it just doesn't fit in the story format. So yeah, I think headlines, read them with a lot of grains of salt.
Thank you. This is probably my last question to you, but if you were a teacher, and specifically Amy, this is for you since you are a professor, I believe. What kind of activities would you encourage students to do?
Oh, I think that especially now, because it's so difficult to get journalism visas to go to China, I really, really always encourage people to learn the language and to study abroad, or to find some way to, in the case of China or in any other country, just to go abroad and experience it in a way that's not through a journalistic lens, because it allows you to engage with people on a level that might be more difficult if you were a journalist in China, for example. And having the language really unlocks so many fascinating conversations and life stories, and I just think it's really important. And
Yeah,
I'm hoping to take my class.
I
Yeah,
couldn't agree
Asia.
more emphatically. In fact, I know I keep bringing up Peter Hessler, but he gave this fantastic talk at Duke that your alma mater, Butchin, but he gave a fantastic talk at Duke the other day, and I was in the audience for that. When he said he had sort of some of his precepts for how to report, and two of the things that really stuck with me. One is, don't go into reporting to report an idea or a theme. Start with place and people. Anchor it in sort of the way that a novelist would. I mean, I know this is particular to his format, which is long form kind of narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction, in fact. But the other thing that he said, and I think this is applicable to all journalists, is, as Amy said, learn the language, learn it well enough so that you can go out and do independent reporting, and do not roll deep. Do not have an entourage with you. Don't send the photographer later. If you are managing an interpreter, a fixer, a translator, a photographer, your time will be divided, your attention will be divided. You won't be able to focus, and you won't be able to draw out those human stories on a one-to-one level that I think really make for memorable reporting. That was fantastically good advice.
Thank you.
And I would just add one thing also. If it feels too overwhelming, as it would for me, to just take on a Peter Hessler style, like people and places and a long book length project, like, I think another big unlock for me in my time reporting in China was finding out how much I loved writing obituaries. It sounds very morbid, but it's actually the best way to really understand China and its context, because you're really looking at one story and trying to put it in the context of history. And oftentimes the people that you're writing obituaries of have had these long, rich lives that have really spanned so many different eras of Chinese history. And to be able to see that from the beginning of their life and write about that is really helps you understand the way that the country or the place that wherever you're writing about has sort of changed over time, through the lens of one person. So I find that, I think that might be, kind of sort of less intimidating challenge for students who are looking to start writing.
Thank you. Bochen, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, talk to if you have, I don't know how how young your students are. But I was gonna say encourage your students if they can to talk to Chinese students here or other people coming from China here. I think something that I realized recently was just and I don't know why it took me so long to realize this, was just like on everything that you see online is just going to be more exaggerated, accentuated, because that's just how the online environment works. I recently did a story about how top students at Chinese and U.S. universities are actually very open-minded, very curious about the other side, very pragmatic as opposed to ideological in their approach. And this was based on, talking to students both here in the US and also in China. And this is, but if you just go online and look at social media and look at what's in other internet forums, you see a lot more nationalism. I think just because the online environment encourages more of these things, you see a lot of reporting about, rising youth nationalism in China. But if you actually talk to young Chinese people, either here or in China, you'll find that they're much more nuanced in person.
Amen. Absolutely. Amen. I mean, that is one of my big bugbears. I mean, one of the things that I really hate is the cherry picking of online quotes. And just marshaling that as evidence of for whatever thesis it is that you're carrying. That stridency is just sort of endemic to social media. I mean, if you go on, you want that little squirt of dopamine. Everyone posts something and then checks back 10 minutes later to see who liked it or retweeted it or whatever. And you find out that, if you say something even-handed, kind of milk toast, it's not going to get traction. But you find out right away that you get rewarded if you say something really snarky or super strident, or and so extremism gets awarded. You get rewarded for using activating language. Activation is like hate, resentment, indignation, that sort of thing, and that's really a pity. It's a terrible function of social media. I have two other maybe big bugbears of mine that I want to get out there. One of them is what I would call the monolithic myth, and there's this terrible tendency, and often this shows up in headlines worse than other places, where something that happens at a local level as a result of a local policy is attributed to China in totality. So if we can imagine a Chinese headline written about, say, a school district in Tennessee that bans the teaching of evolution, say, or critical race theory, and it said, rather than district in Tennessee bans this, it said the U.S. bans so and so. That would be, we would recognize that immediately as completely inaccurate and unfair. But it happens constantly when writing about China. So yeah, I'll stop that one. But there's so many more that just drive me nuts that we could get to.
I guess I get you guys for one more question. And so there are just so many here and it's so difficult to cherry pick. But, one of the questions that we received, and it ties back to, a session that I had listened in on with Dimitri from the Financial Times, that he'd articulated that, there are folks in DC that can be extremely hawkish, and this plays into some of the negative kind kind of headlines and reports that we're seeing, right? So DC is extremely hawkish, and sometimes, those who have more maybe dovish sentiments are afraid to speak out their views publicly. So, just is there or can critical or maybe negative reporting help with cultural understanding? And how can we be both empathetic toward China and insistent on our own principled stance? And I want to couple that with, is there a role, and what role does journalism play in de-escalating any tensions and competition narratives?
I mean, I sit in Washington, but cover Asian American communities around the country, and I see part of my job as to, well, I cover many different communities, but I also cover the Chinese community in the U.S. And I hope that with this beat, which I'm feel so lucky to have, it's not a lot of people, not a lot of outlets can afford to have someone focused on communities. I would love to be able to also center stories on Chinese people in America too, and not just I see in DC. I see the policy discussions and the politicians and the talk about U.S. China and China here all the time. And I think just by hopefully by putting more stories out there that are about how Chinese people see these issues, and knowing that knowing myself just the extreme diversity of opinions on China, on the U.S. within this community, that we can sort of start to see it less as the monolith and more as just humans, which is what we all are.
It's a good note to end on. Our humanity, our shared humanity is always a good one.
I was going to say, I think because journalism really thrives on being interesting or surprising or dramatic, that it actually has a lot of space for more contrarian narratives. I know it kind of perhaps played a role in creating a more hawkish consensus, but I think there's also room for it to present stories that challenge that. And I think, as Amy kind of alluded to, journalism is a space where you can really present human stories, and stories that really explore people who have more complex opinions and views on the world, instead of more stereotypes or dehumanizing assumptions. So I think more human-centric stories can help break some of the
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Absolutely. Yeah. Something beyond. I mean, one editor once quipped that there are only three kinds of China stories. There's big China, bad China, and weird China, and that's all we're limited to. But yeah, no, human China is the one that I want to read.
So here, hopefully that in the future we get more access, more boots on the ground, and get those human stories to really build those bridges. And hopefully there will be a future for student exchanges, a return to student exchanges, to have that once again be the norm. So what a fantastic way to end, very hopeful. And everyone, please join me in thanking our sponsors, my co-moderator, teacher extraordinaire, and his students for some of the great questions that were asked, our esteemed speakers for really making the time to impart a slice of their profound knowledge and wisdom. And I hope, like me, you learned much more about what goes behind the scenes in editorial and journalistic integrity, and also just about the reporting process and what goes behind a story more generally. So recording will be made available on our YouTube channel in the coming days, and we'll also send out a follow-up email with all of the resources that were kind of shared from, Peter Hessler's kind of materials and things like that. And, really until next time, just subscribe to our newsletter for updates. And I would be remiss, but in the spirit of Giving Tuesday, we hope that you will consider a small donation to help us continue organizing these teachers' workshops. So thank you all very much for your time, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having us.